I don't like making negative videos, but every year we see some highly drafted wide receivers disappoint for fantasy football. Maybe not to straight up like bust category, but just don't really differentiate themselves from other receivers that you could have gotten later. So I have 5 names of wide receivers that I am not touching at all in my fantasy drafts, going between rounds 2 through 4, and at the end of the video, I'll even share some names that I would rather draft instead. So let's start with the highest drafted name on the list in Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Now, it was a great year for JSN in 2024, finishing as a top 10 fantasy wide receiver, even after a slower start, and from week 8 on, averaged nearly 18 PPR fantasy points per game. And now, heading into 2025, well, DK Metcalf has been traded to Pittsburgh, Tyler Lockett is now signed to Tennessee, even Noah Fant just recently got cut, and with the only real additions to the receiving core being just Cooper Kupp, a rookie tight end, and 2 day 3 rookie wide receivers, Jason's probably going to see 150 plus targets this year because they don't really have anyone else to throw to, and he's by far the best wide receiver on the team. So why am I avoiding him at his ADP? Well, truth be told, I am terrified of Sam Darnold at quarterback. I know he was tremendous last year in Minnesota, but I think that was more of a product of Kevin O'Connell's offense and the weapons all around him than it was Sam Darnold just suddenly being fixed. And I think the biggest difference that Darnold is going to face in Seattle versus Minnesota is the offensive line. PFF's end of season grades for offensive lines last year had Minnesota ranked at 18th compared to Seattle down at 31st. PFF also released their 2025 offensive line rankings. Minnesota was ranked 7th while Seattle was ranked down at 30th. That is a huge difference for a quarterback who literally admitted to seeing ghosts on the field the last time his offensive line sucked that bad. Without the security of a good offensive line or the safety blanket of Justin Jefferson to bail him out on bad throws or just defenders breaking through the line, I am extremely pessimistic on Darnold's outlook for 2025. So for JSN, even though his situation seems to have opened up as the last man standing in this receiving room, he is getting a downgrade at quarterback and possibly more defensive attention thrown his way as a team's wide receiver 1 with minimal other threats around him for defenses to really worry about. The formula to beat Seattle this year is really going to be easy. It's going to be get pressure on Darnold against a bad offensive line and double team Jaxon Smith-Njigba. I'm sure his end of season numbers are probably going to get him to one of the most targeted receivers in the league, probably over 1,000 yards again. But without breaking 1,100 yards and without scoring 8 or more touchdowns without 1,100 yards, JSN is not going to be a good pick in the 3rd round, let alone the late 2nd, where I've seen him go in some best ball drafts. Now, going right after JSN in ADP, and also coincidentally was also right after him in PPR points per game last year, is my next wide receiver fade in Garrett Wilson. And I already see it now. There's already people in the comments typing out that Wilson had a huge year in 2024. He had a wide receiver 10 finish, and now he doesn't have Davante Adams to compete with, so his 2025 could be just as good or even better without Davante Adams. Plus, he's got Justin Fields. Justin Fields and Garrett Wilson were college teammates at Ohio State, so they already have chemistry, and Justin Fields was the one to finally unlock DJ Moore for fantasy football, so we can just do that again with Garrett Wilson. And those are all really fun narratives to spin in Garrett Wilson's favor, but in my opinion, none of them really matter. So let's attack them one by one. One, yes, he technically broke out for fantasy last year with a wide receiver 10 finish in PPR scoring, but kind of like Jaxon Smith-Njigba, that is on a total points basis where he beat out other receivers with health rather than by actually producing well all year. On a points per game basis, that wide receiver 10 finish drops to wide receiver 21. His receiving yards weren't any different than in 2022 or 2023. His target volume was pretty much the same. His yards per reception dropped for the 3rd year in a row. The only real difference was 7 total touchdowns compared to 4 and 3 in the last 2 years, and his catch percentage rose from 56% to 65% because of Aaron Rodgers. But there really wasn't a major difference in end of season numbers that suggests that he actually broke out. So now we enter year 4, and guess what? We have a new offensive coordinator, his 3rd in 4 years. We have a new head coach. We have a new quarterback. Davante Adams is gone, but targets have literally never been Garrett Wilson's issue. So I don't think Adams leaving really matters all that much. I just don't believe that 2025 is going to be very different than 2022, 2023, or even 2024. Now, when you're talking about Fields and Garrett Wilson playing together, do you realize how long it's been since they've played together in college? It's been 5 years. Back in 2020, they played 14 games together in 2019, but Wilson was 4th on the team in receptions that season. Then they played 8 games in a shortened 2020 season due to COVID, and Wilson was still 2nd on the team behind Chris Olave in receptions that year. Is that really what we're hanging our hats on for Wilson's year 4 breakout with his old college teammate buddy? And let's not forget the 5 years of NFL tape that Justin Fields has put out there. He is objectively a bad NFL quarterback who is a career 61% completion percentage passer and has never topped 2,600 yards in a season or thrown for more than 17 touchdowns. Wilson is going to have a huge target share just to match what he's done the last 3 years with 1,100 yards and a handful of touchdowns with Justin Fields throwing in the ball maybe 450 times total this year. Then as for the DJ Moore unlocking, did you know DJ Moore is quite literally the only wide receiver that Fields has ever supported for more than 12 PPR points per game? The only one. It took Russell Wilson coming in for George Pickens to actually do well last year for the Steelers, who with Justin Fields was on pace for 75 receptions, over 1,000 yards, 0 total touchdowns with a 60% reception percentage. I don't really know what happened with DJ Moore that was different than literally every other wide receiver Fields has ever played with, but I also don't want to hang my hat on who is currently the one exception, not the standard. I get that there are signals that make Garrett Wilson an enticing option to draft in 2025, but I think there are just as many or even more signals telling me to just pivot to someone else who maybe has a similar floor, but a way higher ceiling, and not to tie myself to Garrett Wilson or really for that matter to Justin Fields' passing, as again, my potential fantasy wide receiver 1 on my team. And why not just keep the train rolling of top 10 producers in 2024 who may not be as good this year, because I'm also out on Terry McLaurin. Story here for McLaurin is pretty much the same as it was for JSN and Garrett Wilson. We had a huge breakout year for him in 2024 with an elite quarterback in Jaden Daniels. He was the wide receiver 7 in total points, which was better than CeeDee Lamb and just behind Malik Neighbors. So we had a tremendous season for Terry McLaurin. Mostly. Again, when we look at a points per game basis, McLaurin's wide receiver 7 season drops to wide receiver 16, which is still pretty good, especially because his ADP puts him around wide receiver 18, so his cost compared to last season production still looks solid on both a total points and points per game basis, unlike JSN or Garrett Wilson, who produced worse than Terry McLaurin and are going higher in drafts. What scares me about McLaurin are really just 2 reasons. Number 1, his breakout 2024 was on the back of extreme touchdown efficiency. His targets, receptions, and yards were really no different than he's had any other year with any other quarterback. But 13 touchdowns is nearly double his previous career high and almost as many as he had in the previous 3 seasons combined. If you take away just 3 of his touchdowns last year and give him 10, which is still a really high number, he drops to wide receiver 11 overall, wide receiver 22 in points per game. Take away 2 more and just give him 8 touchdowns, which is still a career high for him, and he drops to wide receiver 17 overall and wide receiver 31 in fantasy points per game. That is terrifying. Maybe Daniels doesn't take that next step in year 2 and his passing touchdowns kind of stagnate, or maybe he does elevate, but he does that by rushing more and scores more on the ground himself. Maybe Brian Robinson or Austin Eckler finish a couple more drives themselves than through Terry McLaurin. Maybe Deebo Samuel, their new addition this year, vultures some of the touchdowns away from Terry McLaurin as an elite wide receiver 2 option, or Ben Sinnott progresses in year 2, scores once or twice that he didn't last year. There are just a bunch of ways that Washington can throw for 30 passing touchdowns again in 2025, like they did in 2024, but McLaurin doesn't get to 13 touchdowns again, or even to 10 in the double digits. Now, the second reason he could be less efficient this year is from the current contract holdout that he's doing. In my opinion, extended holdouts into late August or even early September to the start of the season hardly really ever work out for anyone involved. The team always ends up caving and pays the guy anyway, and I feel like most times that player underperforms that year because they missed all that practice time in August to really ramp up and get ready for the season. Perfect example, Brandon Ayuk last year, who held out until August 29th, sucked for 6 games in the year, then tore his ACL. That is worst case scenario for Terry McLaurin, absolutely, but it's a reality that could exist this year, especially since the reports are that both sides are vastly apart on a new deal. McLaurin wants $30 million a year. Washington is nowhere near that. So the longer this holdout goes on, the more I fear for a down year for Terry McLaurin that will not live up to his ADP, on top of the touchdown regression that I'm already scared of. There's just no way that I draft him in the late 3rd or even 4th round of my drafts, even as my fantasy wide receiver 2, when there are just better options around him. This video is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. Fantasy football is officially back, and we here at 4for4 are fired up. Group chats are already buzzing, rankings are locked in, and I've got a few bold takes that I'm probably going to regret by week 2. This year on 4for4, we are playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should as well. Whether you're a first timer or you're a veteran making your millionth league, I have always appreciated how easy Yahoo makes the draft experience, how clean the app is, and how customizable the leagues are. Plus, it's just a fun platform to be on all season long. To celebrate 28 years of fantasy greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days, giving you more ways to play, more ways to draft, and more ways to win. It all begins on August 4th, so stay tuned and get started by creating or joining a Yahoo Fantasy Football League today at yahoofantasy.com/TMAP. That's yahoofantasy.com/TMAP, yahoofantasy.com/TMAP. Going one spot after Terry McLaurin in ADP is actually our first underperformer from 2024, but still carries name value and hope for 2025. It's Cardinals wide receiver Marvin Harrison Jr. And I'm just now realizing that every single player that we've talked about so far is a former Ohio State wide receiver. And I will admit, I am a Penn State fan and alumnus, but I promise this is all coincidence. This is not my Penn State fandom or Ohio State bias coming in here. Prove it to you. Draft Emeka Egbuka late in drafts this year. I don't think you're going to regret that. Anyway, let's play a game here with Marvin Harrison Jr. I'm going to read off a list of players, and I want you to just mentally guess whether Marvin Harrison Jr. outproduced those guys on a points per game basis last year. You ready? Rashid Shaheed, Juwan Jennings, DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, Keenan Allen, Khalil Shakir, Calvin Ridley, Darnell Mooney, Adam Thielen. Which of those players do you think Marvin Harrison Jr. outproduced last year in fantasy points per game? If you answered none of them, you would be 100% correct. Every single one of those players averaged more fantasy points per game than Marvin Harrison Jr., who is actually tied with Quentin Johnston as the wide receiver 42 with 11.6 PPR points per game. Yet, he's being drafted as a top 20 wide receiver again this year, ahead of everybody that I just read off, including a couple more very good names. And let me just make one thing clear here. I do think the Marvin Harrison Jr. breakout year will come at some point. He's too good of a player to not have a top 12 fantasy season, and I think Kyler Murray is more than capable of sustaining a top 12 receiver for fantasy football like he did with DeAndre Hopkins just a few years ago. But I don't think that breakout season is in 2025, and I'll tell you why. Nothing on this team has changed from last year to this year. It's the same group of players: Kyler Murray, James Conner, Marvin Harrison Jr. You got Trey McBride still, Michael Wilson, Zay Jones, and Greg Dortch behind Marvin Harrison. And it's the same coaching staff under Gannon and Drew Petzing at offensive coordinator. Why should we expect anything significantly different this year than what we had last year? I'll even take it one step further. Those of you who watched my video with John Paulson last week will have heard this, but if you didn't, here it is. I did a quick study on rookie wide receivers drafted in the top 10 of the NFL draft who failed to eclipse 900 yards in year one. Since 2000, that has happened 7 times prior to last year. We had Roy Williams, Larry Fitzgerald, Braylon Edwards, Calvin Johnson, Michael Crabtree, Justin Blackmon, and Drake London. For the sake of the study, I did throw Blackmon out because he ruined his career and he didn't have any data on him for really year 2 and beyond. But the other 6 receivers, they all had a breakout 1,000-yard season somewhere between years 2 through 4. Megatron and Larry Fitzgerald had it in year 2, Williams, Edwards, and London in year 3, Crabtree in year 4. What is interesting, though, is the timing of their breakout years. Every single one of those receivers broke out after an offensive coaching change was made. Megatron and Fitz had different offensive coordinators in year 2 that they then broke out in year 2. Williams required 2 different OCs in year 2 and year 3 to then break out in year 3. Edwards and London, they both retained the same head coach and offensive coordinator in year 2, didn't break out. Then changes were made for their teams in year 3, then they subsequently broke out. And Michael Crabtree went through the same coaches in year 2, didn't break out, changed coaches in year 3, didn't break out, but then broke out in year 4 with the coaches that he got in year 3. And just for fun, if you wanted to include Justin Blackmon, he also got different coaches in year 2, rattled off over 400 yards and a touchdown in the 4 games that he played that year before getting completely nixed out of the NFL. So had he stayed clean, he probably would have been great, and that also happened with coaching changes from year 1 to year 2. So every single one of those receivers broke out after a change in coaching staff, either a new offensive coordinator at the absolute minimum or a new head coach and offensive coordinator entirely. The 3 players who retained the same head coach and offensive coordinator from year 1 to year 2, Edwards, Crabtree, and London, all did not break out in year 2 and really didn't have significantly different second seasons compared to their rookie year. Why? Because their offense and coaching philosophies didn't change. London is a perfect recent example because he was a pretty elite prospect coming out of USC, was the clear-cut wide receiver 1 on the Falcons with very little target competition in 2023, and was being drafted in the 3rd round heading into his 2nd year because of the hope for that breakout season. But he was still playing under Arthur Smith, still playing under the same offensive coordinator. Nothing really changed for coaching, and he was a major bust for drafters that season. My fear is the same thing happens with Marvin Harrison Jr. this year. It is so obvious watching the Arizona Cardinals last year that they just weren't using him right at all. He was running verticals, he was running out routes, just basically stayed on the perimeter all day, clearing out space for Trey McBride over the middle. That usage led to extreme inconsistencies for fantasy with massive dud games that absolutely killed your week. Now, sure, maybe Marvin Harrison Jr. breaks the mold. Arizona figures out how to use him this year. Or maybe he continues the trend of requiring a coaching change to then break out, and that is just a risk I am not willing to make in the early 4th round with better options around him. P.S. Rome Odunze also makes the list of top 10 drafted rookies to not eclipse 900 yards in year 1. And as we know, the Bears overhauled their coaching staff, so he fits the trend that a breakout could happen after the coaching change. If it happens this year, I'm not necessarily sure for Rome Odunze, but he does feel like a better bet this year than Marvin Harrison, and he's going 3 rounds later. And the last receiver that I am not touching this year at his ADP, especially now that I think his ADP rises due to recent news, is Chiefs wide receiver Xavier Worthy, who currently is in the early 5th round according to recent data, but I think that's going to change, and he might even switch places with Rashee Rice, who is being drafted in the 4th or even 3rd rounds of drafts prior to the probation and jail sentence that Rice received last week. Now, I understand that Worthy could expand upon the end-of-season growth that we saw last year, especially with Rashee Rice getting suspended this year, but I also don't think that Worthy is the type of player that is going to turn into a high-volume producer that translates into consistent top 15 fantasy production. Fun fact, all of those players that I read off that outproduced Marvin Harrison Jr. last year also apply to Xavier Worthy, who was the PPR wide receiver 45 with 11 fantasy points per game. Another fun fact, whatever number you have in your head for how many receiving yards Worthy had last year, I guarantee that number is too high. Worthy did not eclipse 900 yards last year, nor did he eclipse 800 yards, nor did he eclipse 700 yards, nor did he eclipse 650 rushing yards in 16 games last year. He had 638 yards and 6 touchdowns on 59 receptions. That was his year 1 rookie season stat line. And I would bet the only positive thing that you really remember about Worthy's season last year was the 50-yard touchdown that he caught at the end of the Super Bowl against the Eagles' backup secondary. Even in his breakout second half run from weeks 11 through 17, Worthy was still just the wide receiver 19 in fantasy and wide receiver 24 in points per game over that stretch, pacing for 950 yards on 95 receptions. Those are weeks without Rashee Rice and mostly without Hollywood Brown, who barely played in weeks 16 and 17. So Worthy was by himself for 5 games of that stretch and still wasn't producing as anything more than barely even a wide receiver 2. So now in 2025, Travis Kelce is still there. Hollywood Brown is back and now healthy. Isaiah Pacheco is back and healthy, so the run game might be more effective. And yeah, Rice will get suspended, but it's only really going to be for 3 to 4 games, 6 at the absolute most, which means we're bumping up Worthy's ADP based on not having Rashee Rice for 25% of the season, completely disregarding the fact that he will be present and healthy for the other 75% of the season. I just can't imagine drafting Xavier Worthy in the 4th round when we still have questions on if he's the wide receiver 1 when Rashee Rice gets back, or even without Rashee Rice, and if Kelce or Hollywood interfere more this year. It's just too much hope and unknown for me to buy into over other proven talents as my wide receiver 2. Now, as mentioned at the beginning of this video, all of these guys are very close in ADP in the 3rd and 4th round. So if I'm not drafting any of these guys, who am I actually drafting? Well, I like a lot of the running backs in this range. I love Chase Brown. I love Kyron Williams, James Cook, Alvin Kamara in there. You even got Chuba Hubbard and James Conner, who technically are early 5th round ADPs, but do get drafted in the 4th round as running backs kind of start to dry up. I would take all of them over these wide receivers, and those are easy names to draft if you start with an elite wide receiver or tight end, a strategy that I'm a bit more bullish on this year, regardless of where you land in the 1st round. So if you go wide receiver early, you can get those running backs in the 3rd and 4th rounds and completely skip over all these other wide receivers. I also love George Kittle's ADP in the 3rd round, I would take him over all of these wide receivers as well, especially if you miss out on Bowers or McBride. I would take even an early quarterback, which generally I am opposed to, but if the decision is between one of these receivers or Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels, or Jalen Hurts, I'm taking the quarterback. And even at the wide receiver position itself, I prefer drafting guys like Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Mike Evans, DJ Moore, and DK Metcalf in this range over the other guys because I think their floors are very similar, but the ceilings are much higher as wide receiver 1s on their teams or wide receiver 1B in Devontae Adams' case. Also, if you fade wide receiver entirely in the 3rd and 4th rounds and you're looking for names to target later in drafts that have a lot of upside, then I highly recommend checking out this video right up here.